Welcome back, friends. In this video, we're going to continue working on our project. So we have this basic interface. This is pretty much where we left off in the last video, something like this. So make sure that the grid view here is connected to the data source that we created down below, like that. First, you've got the submit button, you've got the calendar, you've got the three boxes, and you've got the validators. And then one more thing on the bottom, of course, is the label where we saw some error messages get displayed to prove that the try catch that we created in the C# code actually did something useful for us. So this is a basic interface, and remember in default.aspx.cs, this was our code right here from top to bottom. Roughly, this is all of it. I'm just gonna move things up a little bit. Make sure you see all of it here. Okay. And now let's continue. So the first thing is we're going to style the appearance of things so they look a little bit better than they do now. A little more color and so on. So to accomplish this, on the right side, right-click the name of the project and go over to Add, and then Style Sheet. So we're going to add a style sheet to our project. And you can leave it named Style Sheet. That's fine for our purposes. And this gives you a style sheet.css kind of file. This is where you specify your styles. Styles simply take control of the appearance of the page, and you can make it look and do amazing things with this. Obviously, I'll show you just the basics. So I'm going to delete that default, and I'm going to enlarge the code view a little here. So let's take a look. Say 60, that's good. And the first thing I want to enter is add and then main, like this. So # main. And this is a selector, and we're going to select the main div. We'll enclose everything that gets sent to the browser as HTML in a big div. A div is basically like a logical division of a web page. Okay? We'll enclose it in that div. Take a look. So go into default.aspx for a second, and then switch over to source view. And remember, we had this code generated. Again, all of this, thankfully, is generated automatically. So what I'm going to do is this. Right here, you should see a div. So right under where it says form, you should see a div, and then type ID equals main. You're giving this div an ID. Now make sure that you have the opening div tag here with the ID set to main, and then scroll past all of the code to the bottom, and make sure that the div also has a closing tag. And as you can see, this is all also enclosed in the form. So make sure you've got the closing div also, okay? Good. So let's take a look at the next stage here. So you've got the div enclosing all of our code. So go back to stylesheet.css. So now we can say # main. That means we're going to select that one div that encloses everything, and then we'll style that first. So as an example, I'm going to say border. That speaks for itself. It's just a border. You can set the thickness. They give you an example, so they say 5 pixel solid red. I'm going to go with 2 pixel solid red. And here you make one change, and you go back to default.aspx for a second. Switch to design view, and try to look, see whether it causes some kind of visible change. And it hasn't, because we have to connect the style sheet default.aspx as follows. And now let's do this. So we need to make the connection between the style sheet and default.aspx. Switch into the source view on default.aspx, scroll up to the top, and then within the head section we need to add a reference to the style sheet. So from the right side, from the Solution Explorer, you should see the style sheet after you add it, like that. You see that? So left press on it, and then drag and drop it into the head section. So this here simply adds a reference to the style sheet so it can be applied correctly to the elements in the web page. That's all. All right, so style sheet.css is right here. This is an ID selector. That means it's going to find the div named main with that ID, and it's going to make the border 2 pixels solid red. All right, I hope you've got that. So switch back to default.aspx for a second, and then switch out of this mode over to design mode. And notice that immediately, as you can see, it changes things a little bit. You see? I hope you see that. Okay. So that's one bit of information. Next stage here, I'm going to type this as an example. So border and then radius. The radius simply tells you how rounded the corners appear to be. And I give you some examples, 3 pixels, 4 pixels, and so on. I'm going to go with 3 pixels. So we're making the border rounded. The little corners, instead of having square ones, 90-degree ones, you're going to have them rounded a little bit. Okay, that's the radius of the rounding. Next stage, you can change the background color. So as an example, you can change it to whatever you want. I'm going to choose this one, bisque. And again, as you apply these, go back to default.spx and make sure you are in design mode so you can see what's happening here, okay? Let's change the background color again. As you can imagine, there is a great variety of them, so you can say colon and then choose a different one. Maybe you like agua. Let's see agua, okay? So I've changed the background color to agua. Go back to default.spx for a second. It doesn't look like it's been changed here. So now click on Google Chrome and let's see whether that will actually be applied. The things that we've done. All right, so that looks pretty good. We've got the color, we've got nice rounded corners. If you look very carefully over here, right? You've got a nice rounded corner. You've got the color. Clearly the problem is that you see how the box is right against the border and the writing is right against the border over here. We want to fix that. So we fix that by using padding as follows. Take a look. Let me close this down. Okay, go back to stylesheet.css. And I'm going to restore this original color of bisque. I just wanted to show you how it works, but I personally don't like agua. I think it's too neon-like, too bright. And I'm going to say here padding, for example, and then 5 pixels. So remember, in this window, what we have basically is a selector. Then you've got curly braces. And within that, you have a property, like border. And then you have the value of the property. Sometimes it's a simple value like 3 pixels for the border radius. And sometimes the value, as you can see, is more complex. You've got a width, you've got something like whether it's solid or dashed, and you have a color on top of it. But it's still just a property, colon, and then value. If you think about the text boxes in C#, we had the name of the box, dot, the name of the property, and then you assign a value to it. So in that sense, the logic here is exactly the same. Property, and then it's values. All right, so let's run it in this form with the padding enabled. And as you can see, the color now, I think personally, is much less jarring on the eyes. And now we also have nice padding around the form. As you can see, space. All right, I'm going to close this. Now, additional items. Take a look. If I hit Google Chrome and I run this one more time, I want to show you something. Take a look. And I'm going to zoom out here a little bit. That's too big. All right, let's see what happens if I take this and I just, for example, try to make it smaller. Well, first of all, take a look. You see? What is it doing? It's kind of spreading itself out in a relatively smart way. See that down the page? All right, so it's not so bad. See that? Maybe you want to leave it that way. It's up to you. Except it looks as though the grid, as you can see, is kind of going out of the box. So let me close that for a second. I'm going to add one more property in a value. I'm going to say display. And then inline block. Try that. So let's see what effect that has. Hit Google Chrome. Let this load. All right, and now, again, I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to make it a regular 100. And it looks like this. All right, so push this over. Let's see what happens here. And that looks as shown here. Okay, and I'm going to enlarge it. So go to like, a big mode, 200%, the way we had it in the previous one. And let's see, does the box appear still to be, and you see what's happening now? It's kind of staying within the red area. So let me close that. That effect can be a bit tricky to see, so I'm going to take this and comment it out again. And to comment here, you put /* and then you close with the */. Let's run this one more time. I'm going to make sure we really see the effect. All right, and now let's see, I'm going to push this over. And you see the difference over on the right side. See how the grid view is kind of popping out of the area? I hope you see that. So I'm going to close this. And I'm going to restore the display inline block. So that's that. Another thing that we want to do, obviously, is style also the boxes that we have. Maybe the boxes should have more space around them. Maybe we feel that they're a little too tightly grouped together. We can accomplish that. Take a look. Go to stylesheet.css. And this time I'm going to use a class selector. So I'm going to say dot and then boxes. That's a class selector. This here is an ID selector. For the ID selector, you can have only one item on the page with that specific ID. Okay? This is what I mean. Take a look before I continue. Go back to default.aspx for a second and go over to its source view. And regardless of the complexity of the code, at the end of the closing div tag, type div, and give it the ID equals main, and try to close it. And you see it says another object on this page already uses ID main. So I hope you see what I've just said. One object should have the ID main. That's it, not two. Okay, so go back to the style sheet for a second, and this time we're going to make dot boxes. That means that multiple items on the page will be able to style the same way. So I'm going to say this. I'm going to say width 200 pixels. So property colon the value of the property, and maybe I run some space around the boxes so it doesn't look as though they're touching. I'm going to say, for example, here margin and then 5 pixels. A margin exactly is what it sounds like. So let's take a look. All right, so now the next stage, remember we have this dot boxes. We need to make use of it. So go back to default.aspx. Make sure you're in source view. And I know this code can seem utterly overwhelming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the text box here. And right after where it says run as server, I'm going to say CSS class. Remember, I added a class selector. That's why I can say CSS class. And I'm going to say boxes. So what I'm going to do is apply to this text box item that selector boxes, and it's going to change the appearance of that box a little. And I repeat that for the other ones. So I'm going to say the following here. I'm going to say for enter email also CSS and then boxes. And lastly, down on the bottom for the date box, I already have the CSS boxes. So the CSS, that means cascading style sheet class, and boxes, that simply means that each of the box items that you see in this markup here will be given the styling that you see highlighted here in style sheet.css in blue. That's all. 200 pixels in width and then a margin of 5 pixels. That's it. So let's give it a go in Chrome. Hit Google Chrome. Remember, we've applied the dot boxes to 3 boxes on a page. Okay. And now perhaps the only thing that stands out is the boxes have a little more space around them, as you see here. Okay, so let me zoom in a little bit. So remember, we did the padding. That gave you space around here, around the border, right? So between the border and the box. We did the rounded corners, so they look rounded. Now we've also have done spacing around the boxes to space them out a little more so they don't look cramped together. And we did the background color as bisque. Remember that we have a div going here that contains all of it, but then we have individual CSS applied to each box also. Keep that in mind. Okay, let me close that. All right, make sure it shuts down correctly.